The Power Factor Show with Steve and Rick. Episode 24, Handloading, Part 2.
Gun Rights Radio Network has the best pro-Second Amendment, pro-gun rights podcast available on the net. The podcasts are absolutely free when subscribing using iTunes or Zune Marketplace. Or if you want, you can just listen from the website. Make sure you visit gunrightsradio.com to subscribe. Podcasting freedom, one episode at a time.
All right, here we are back on the Power Factor Show. I'm Rick.
I'm Steve.
And what we're going to do now is get a little more into the nuts and bolts of hand loading. If you've collected your brass and you've got your
or
brass,
collected somebody else's brass,
or better still, collected somebody else's brass, either washed it or tumbled it to clean it. I always tumble it and then wash it to get the tumbling residue off.
That's funny because I do the exact opposite. I'm figuring that the brass is coming from, typically around here in the Seattle area, a muddy rain surface, so it's got mud, rocks, crud, other stuff all over it. So the first thing I do is I take all my brass, throw it into a bucket, throw some soap in there, wash it, let it actually sit for a couple hours just to let the mud totally, decompose. And then I pull it out and wash it again.
With his gun.
Yeah.
He just puts the gun in the bucket. After he's taken the brass out, the gun goes in the bucket.
The brass agitates it nicely. But anyway, so I actually do a double wash process, and then if it's during the summer, I'll put it out on some old ratty cookie sheets that I've got designated for that and let it sit in the sun.
Yeah, me too.
If it's during the winter and I'm trying to speed dry things, I'll stick it in the oven at about 100 degrees. I'll actually turn the oven on for 10 or 15 minutes and then shut it off and put the brass in and just let it dry that way. So
yeah, but you definitely want to make sure it's dry. Water can linger in the primer pocket, so make sure it's dry, clean, and then the next step, or generally the first step, is you've got multiple die sets.
Well, don't we need to tumble it first?
We already tumbled it.
But there's 2 steps to that.
Uh-oh. What's the second step to tumbling it,
Well,
Steve?
the first step to tumbling is using typically walnut media.
That's what I use.
To use the cores. And then to get a good polish, I use corncob. And then the secret added trick there, since I like everything shiny and clean, is I take actually automotive new finish car polish.
Sure.
And just take a couple, maybe a teaspoon of that and put it in there and let that go.
So do you have a separate bowl, one with the walnut in it and one with the corncob in it, or you swap it out?
When I do the walnut, I have a container of walnut and dump that. I dump the corncob out in my special corncob bucket, and I put the walnut in, and then after I'm done doing that, I dump the walnut out and put the corncob back in and back and forth. So
Steve's brass is a lot shinier than mine.
It is.
Let me tell you. Okay, I draw the line.
People admire at my shiny brass.
I draw the line at the second tumbling process. I go to the pet store. I get walnut shells in the lizard bedding department.
There's a cheaper way of doing that. If you go to Harbor Freight, you can get walnut from them for
cheaper.
Real cheap, yeah. Because the lizard litter stuff is about $10 for 5 pounds or something like that.
I think I paid $12.
Yeah. I know the stuff.
Anyway,
it's
convenient really though.
Cheap. Harbor Freight's convenient.
Okay, so you've got your die set. There happily is an industry standard.
Do you want to ask me about corncob media?
Okay, Steve.
I go to a co-op
Where do you get your corncob media?
Go to a co-op store and you can get corncob media there also.
Okay.
God knows what they do with it, but whatever.
Right, exactly. Okay, now that our brass is finally cleaned to Steve's standards.
You want to talk about cleaning some more?
Die sets for straight-walled pistol cases generally come in 3 die sets. Everybody is using some kind of a hardened sizing ring in the sizer die so that you don't have to lube your brass. That's one of the hassles of bottleneck cases and tapered cases, is that you have to lube them and use a regular steel die to resize them. Carbide, nitride, various substances in the sizer ring on these dies means you don't have to lube them before you size them. So the first die is a decapper and resizer, and what it does is punches out the spent primer and resizes the case, squeeze it. When you fire a brass cased round, the case expands and essentially binds or sticks to the walls of the chamber, and then as the pressure subsides, it slightly shrinks back down, and that's
So it
what
can be
allows it to be
extracted.
extracted.
Right.
But it doesn't shrink all the way back down to where it started. So the sizing die squeezes it back down to its original external dimensions. So on a single stage press like this, you'd put your sizer decapper die in the press, and then you have to handle each case individually for that one step, decapping, resizing, put the next case in, decap, resize, cycle through however many rounds you want to load. Then you change to the second die, which is a neck expander.
So you need to put a primer in there first.
You don't have to do it first.
Well, you better be putting a primer back in there before you're going to expand. You're going to size the neck before you put a primer in.
A primer has to be put in the case, and the case neck does have to be expanded.
Yeah.
Can we agree on that?
We'll agree on that.
Okay.
Unless it's dirty brass to begin with.
Right. So you have to change dies after handling the first time to do the decapping and sizing. Remove that die, put in the neck expander. The reason for that, of course, is now you've squeezed the case down to smaller than bullet diameter. And so by putting a slight flare in the case mouth, it allows easier insertion for the bullet in the seating step. Now, as Steve mentioned, you have to seat the primer. On a single stage press, you've got this manual arm. Yeah, exactly. And so as in the process of expanding the case mouth, you want to seat a primer in the case. And so again, now we're handling the case for the second time to accomplish that. Now the third, did I miss a step?
Nope.
Okay, now depending on how you're numbering at home, this is our third or our fourth step. Next step is going to be seating the bullet.
Now you did miss a step.
Oh, what did I miss? Putting the powder in.
You like squibblets, don't you? Yeah.
Yeah, we got to put the powder in there. I don't use this press much, so if I miss the steps up. The problem is the complexity of. There was a kind of rule of thumb that said the single stage press is where you should start because it's easy. The problem is because you have to handle each case 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
I think that actually makes it more likely that an error is going to be introduced.
Double charge, no charge. Yeah.
Yeah, forgetting to put the primer in.
Yeah.
And so it's easy, it's simple, but I think ultimately it actually is less efficient and not the best way to go in a lot of ways. It's all out hanging out here in the open is why I'm essentially demonstrating on it. But after you've got your dies swapped in and out, you got your powder and your bullet in it,
Yeah.
then you can apply a taper crimp using the same, in this case, the same die as you're using for the bullet seating. And we're going to actually load.
And some actually, there's a 4-die set. Sometimes they do like there's a designated seating die and then a designated crimping die.
If you've got that's essentially intended for progressive press where you've got multiple stations. You have to adjust it once for the seating and then adjust it again for the.
All right.
So that's kind of the running through the steps, sequence of steps, in some cases kind of out of sequence steps of how to load the cartridges. But we're going to actually now do a demo on the progressive press. It's the kind of deal where you've got in this case, essentially all 4 dies are mounted in the press, and so all 4 of them need to be independently adjusted so that they can all work together. Because unlike this press where there's one step per pass on the case, in the progressive press, all 4 steps: the de-priming, resizing, case mouth belling, primer seating, each crank of the handle. Essentially, after you've done the first initial 3 pulls, you're getting a loaded cartridge with each pull of the handle.
Right.
So after, for instance, now again, we're back to the Dillon square deal. This is an auto indexing press, which means that not only are you getting 4 steps done per pull of the handle, but each time you pull the handle, the shell plate rotates automatically. A lot of presses, you have to manually rotate the shell plate between steps.
Yeah, it's kind of one of the defining features between the 550 and the 650 is the 550 is a manual index, but the 650 is automatic. It automatically indexes it for you.
Yeah, and this press, like a lot of the presses, can really be heavily accessorized with case feeders, so that you don't have to individually insert the cases into the press as you're loading. They're bullet feeders.
Yeah.
So I mean, essentially, like you could get to the point where you can automate it to the extent that all you have to do is pull the handle.
Yeah.
You know, and I think you could motorize that.
Yeah.
But this press is, is about as automated as it gets. Kind of at the regular personal reloading level as opposed to commercial reloading.
Right. The hobbyist level, I think it's probably about as advanced, or sort of as automated, like you're saying, as it's going to be.
So the press, you're going to have to set your press up at a height that's comfortable for you. I had this bench built at a height specifically for reloading. This press is mounted on what's called a strong mount, which raises it another 8 or 10 inches above the press or above the table. I've also got a light here, and the light shines into the station on the press where the powder charged case is. And that allows me, as that case rotates into position, to look and see that there's powder in that case. That's kind of one of the steps that I like to do. I've had issues in the past with squibs. Squibs mean rounds that either have no powder or insufficient, incomplete powder charges in them, and that can be due to a number of issues. Static electricity buildup in the powder measure. I've never had that problem, but some have. There's a problem referred to as powder bridging, where powder can kind of get clogged in this funnel area, and so you'll get a charge that's light as the powder kind of coagulates in the funnel, and then you'll get a big dump of powder when the weight, overcomes the jam, and so you'll have low powder charges followed by heavy powder charges. And just to kind of avoid that, or not to avoid it, but to prevent it from causing trouble, I look at each case after.
There's something else that can cause that in terms of varying powder charge, is that some of the very light, fluffy powders, what you need to do is make sure that your powder hopper here is full of powder, because of basically you have a column of powder and gravity forcing that into the powder bar. The fluffy powders will compress, and the more condensed powder, like the ball powders or whatever, don't seem to suffer from that as much. So a couple tricks you can do, three things. They make baffles in some cases for some of these powder hoppers. I think Unique Tech makes a baffle for that or something or other. Or what you can do is just make sure that the powder hopper is always at least half full.
Yeah.
The other thing is that you can sometimes go in there and actually polish the inside of this lower part of the powder hopper to make sure that basically the powder isn't sticking in that area. It's got a nice slick surface to drop straight in. So
I generally try to work off the top half of the powder measure.
Yeah.
I loaded a couple hundred rounds the other night, and this is half full. Before I do another loading session, I'll fill it up,
Right.
and then a couple hundred rounds will drop it back down to about half. So work off the top half rather than the bottom half of the powder measure. This is the primer feeder, primer magazine tube. This is actually the low primer warning. When it gets down to the point that you're almost out of primers, the buzzer will go off. You can also get a similar warning like this that fits in the top of the powder measure, so that as your powder level gets to a predetermined point, the warning will go off there. And these are just little battery operated buzzers, and it's nice if you're cranking out powder and you're watching Oprah instead of paying attention to what you're doing. Those warnings are there.
I think Dylan also makes a low powder warning in the case thing too, that somehow, I don't know how.
If you've got a case feeder?
No, it somehow will determine if you have powder in the case.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
in a given case.
Yeah,
Okay.
I believe so.
Okay,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
cool.
yeah.
So the equivalent of the die set here on this single stage press is just 4 small tubular dies that fit into this upper part of the housing. The Square Deal is one of the few presses on the market that does not use these industry standard
7/8.
dies.
Yeah.
It's a proprietary design. They're very small, and you're limited to the number of die sets that you can get from Dillon, but it's fairly extensive. If you're loading a common pistol caliber, they do have a die set for it. We've got the powder measure primers. This is a little reservoir that catches the spent primers, and you have to set all this stuff up, again, using your powder scale, set your powder measure. You need a wrench to adjust your various settings for how much the case mouth is belled, how deep the bullet is seated, how much taper crimp is applied, and so there's a certain amount of setup time, and that's one of the nice things about having these interchangeable tool heads is when you remove this tool head, it takes all the settings with it. So I can do my settings. This is set up now for the 200 grain round nose bullet that I use, the charge of Clay's powder that I use, and I mean that's 90% of the rounds I load use this powder charge and that bullet. And so if I want to change tool heads to a different cartridge, different bullet or whatever, I can just pull that off, and then when I want to go back to my favorite load, just put that right back on. The tool head, or the shelf plate, has 4 stations that correspond to the 4 dies in the press. There's little pins that retain the cases in each station. There's a small piece of wire that acts as a little case ejector that bumps the loaded round out and runs it into this reservoir box. Anything else, Steve?
I was going to mention that when you are initially dialing in a charge, what I like to do is to make sure I've got a good average running is I'll throw 10. Well, actually, when I first fill it up, or if I make any changes, I'll throw 3 to clear it. So if I make an adjustment here to the powder setting, I'll throw 3 just to make sure that I'm consistent there.
Yeah.
Then I will throw 10 charges, weigh the 10, divide by 10 to figure out my average, and do that again just to make sure that I'm consistently throwing the same, make sure that it's very consistent when I do that. And if I can throw basically 10 times 2 or 20 charges and have the average come out to where it's consistent, at that point I'll then go ahead and start actually cranking up ammunition.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing that we would need to mention here in terms of safety is whenever you're reloading, always wear eye protection. It is critical that you wear eye protection while reloading, because you just don't know when something may happen, if something, a round goes off or a primer goes off or whatever. Years ago when I was using my Lee turret press using the hand loader thing, I was sitting in my family room after loading up 100 primers into the tray, watching TV and trying to put one into a case and wasn't paying attention when I did, and chain detonated the whole entire thing, and I had nearly 100 anvils in my ceiling. So. Yeah. Unfortunately, I was wearing eye protection when it happened, but I mean, stuff like that can happen. So
I read a story about
a
guy who set a primer off in the case, and of course, there's little paths that run through the press where the parts articulate and whatnot, and so the primer came out the bottom and buried itself about a half an inch into his leg.
Wow!
And I for some reason doubted that tiny little primer could cause that much damage, so I decided I had to test it. I put a frying pan on the oven, turned the heat up.
You and Mythbusters, huh?
Put a couple of primers on there, cracked open a beer, and within a couple of minutes they went off. And like Steve said, I mean, I don't know how the cups were facing this way in the frying pan, but after they went off, the cups were buried about a half inch in the ceiling, 6 feet away. So they're very powerful. And the magazine here with 100 primers in it is right in front of your face.
The other thing that they do here at the Dillons is this: there's a tube within a tube. You have the primer tube is inside, and there's this hardened outside tube. So if you chain detonate all those, they go out and up, but they don't go.
Yeah, this outer tube is like a rifle barrel.
Yes.
I mean, it's a stout piece of metal, and then there's a little tube inside that's primer diameter that the primers are actually feeding through. But yeah, this is a stout magazine tube on the outside.
Right.
Okay. So I'm going to load a few rounds on my progressive press. I'm going to go through the steps that I generally go through. One of the things you'll see in advertisements for progressive press is how many rounds per hour they can put out. I think Dillon claims you can load like 300 to 400 rounds an hour. I've never actually been able to load more than 200 rounds in any 1 hour, but still, it's considerably faster than the single stage. So the process that I'll usually go through is I try to, I don't let a lot of people mess around with my reloading equipment, but I like to check it to make sure that things are where I left it. So I'll take a case and fill it with 2 powder charges, because I know that this particular charge that I'm using just about fills the case. So if I do 2 powder charges and the case is almost full, I know the powder measure hasn't been messed around with. I'll usually do that 2 or 3 times just to kind of warm it up. I don't know that it's absolutely necessary, but after powder's been sitting in it for a while, I like to cycle it a few times just to, like I said, kind of warm it up. Make sure I've got enough primers in the magazine. all the adjustments. I've got the other thing to consider is how you want your components laid out, so they're easy to reach. Dylan sells some accessories to put a little tray for bullets here and whatnot. I just like to keep things close, but not too close. I've got mixed brass. It's all been cleaned and polished, but there's multiple head stamps. With 45 auto brass, one of the things you have to keep an eye out for is more and more 45 auto now has small pistol primers. Used to be, they all had large primers. So I always check to see if it's a small primer or not before loading it. It'll kind of mess up the process if I don't. I also separate out GI brass from commercial brass. I don't know that that's necessary, but I've always done it, so I continue to do it. So I look at the head stamp. I see that that's a GI case, so I throw it in the GI box. Look at this one. Oh, it's another GI. Throw it in there. Now here's a case mouth that's kind of beat up. It's beaten out of round. And this one is probably not so beat up that it can't just be run through the press to straighten it out. Sometimes, especially if there's a sharp corner on the edge of the case, when you run it into the press, it will kind of turn the case inside rather than rounding it out. So I think this one's going to be okay. So we'll slip it into the first station. And again, this station is the resizer and decapper. So we'll run the ram up. You hear the spent primer falls out. You see the primer feed mechanism here is loading up. Now you'll see that the shell plate turns, putting that case now in position 2, where the primer feed is now placed a primer at the base of this case. So by pushing this handle forward, that now seats the primer in the case. So that's the first step. Now I go to get a second case. Again, another GI. Having good luck with this. Here's another commercial case, the way I like it. Put that in station 1. Run that up again. Now, of course, we get two steps are being done at the same time. We've got the resizing and decapping done at station 1, and now station 2 has activated the powder measure and is filling the case with powder. Now when I bring the ram back down, the shell plate rotates. That spring should have pulled that back. And I seat the primer again. So again, another case. Now we have to start feeding the case in on station 1, feeding the bullet in on station 3. That's where the die is that will seat the bullet to the proper depth. Now I take my bullet and I want to set it on top of the case, which was besides being charged and primed on this station, the case mouth was belled, and I want that bullet to sit as straight as possible on the case. The die in the third station has a funnel effect to it that will help straighten the bullet out as if it feeds in and it's not straight on the case, but the straighter you start it, the straighter it'll go in. So now I've got cases, bullet. Here we go for another cycle of the dies. Okay, now from this point on, if I continue to feed cases into station 1 and continue to put the bullets on the expanded and charged case in station 3, each pull of the handle should result in a loaded round. And that's the beauty of the progressive press, is from this point on, each pull will accomplish all 4 steps. And there's our loaded round. I generally randomly check each maybe 10 rounds, 15 rounds. I'll pull one out and run it through a case gauge. This is precision, essentially the equivalent of a die, the inside diameter and length for the cartridge. This one's for 45 auto. If the bullet does not protrude from this end, the overall length is not excessive. If it fits in flush on this end, the rim is not oversized. The external dimension of the round is not oversized. This particular gauge, and you also want it to fall out like that, you don't want it to bind in there. This particular gauge is very tight. I'll find maybe 1%, 2% of the rounds that I load will be kind of sticky going into this gauge. But even rounds that won't fit in this gauge will readily fit in a barrel. So here's an old 45 auto barrel, and I'll take rounds out of this gauge that are tight in there, and they're still loosey-goosey in an actual barrel. So this is kind of overkill, but if it fits in here, it definitely will fit in the barrel, so it's not a bad bad idea to do at least random spot checks. So I'll continue cycling through this until I've loaded as many rounds as I want to. I rarely load more than 200 rounds at a time. That's about as much time as that's about an hour, and that's about as much time as I can really concentrate on it. It's something you don't want to be distracted. You don't want to have your mind wandering, and 200 rounds is about the limit for me, so I'll usually reload for an hour or so. I'll box up the 200 rounds that I load, stow them, and put it away until I'm ready for the next session. After I've loaded my 200 rounds, I box them up. I use these plastic hinged lid boxes. They're durable. They allow me to put a label on the box, in the box, that I can actually read through the lid rather than having to stick something on there and peel it off. Once they're in the box, one of the things that I do is hold the whole box up to the light and look along the bases of the cases to see that the primers are all seated flush. They should actually be seated slightly below flush, but what I'm looking for is a primer that's maybe a little bit cocked or sticks up above the surface of the rim. So with 50 at a time in there, I can just hold the whole box up, look along there, and see that they're flush. Occasionally you'll also find one that's been flipped upside down, and so pull those out, of course. And so if you've done your random gauging, you've checked your primer levels, made sure everything is seated properly, that should be a good box of ammo. Okay, so some other things. We've got all of our kind of volatile components, our gunpowder, our primers, and you want to be at least a little bit careful about where you stow the stuff. Most powder measures have a clear plastic column like this, and you don't want to leave it out in the sun. I know I'm one of the few people I think that is really always covering up my powder, and I've never had any problems with it, but I know people who don't do this and they don't have any problems either. So,
Right.
Yeah. So you want to keep most of your components, all your components, I mean the bullets obviously it doesn't really matter, but your primer and your powders especially, you want to keep them in the cool, dry place.
And the general rule of thumb is if you'd be happy there, then your components, your powder, your primers would probably be happy there too. So.
And you want to keep stuff in its original container.
Yeah.
This is, for instance, this is a kind of a medium burn rate powder. If I were to substitute the quantity of a fast burning powder that I would use for a load with this powder, you damage the gun. You just don't want to mix them up. I will generally, if I'm loading, let's say, not something that I'm leaving set up indefinitely, but something I'm just loading for the day, I will leave the powder jug out on the counter. I mean, this is the jug for what's in this. If it's something that I'm going to leave it set up for a while, I'll generally stick a label on here that indicates what powder and what charge weight is in here, so I don't forget, oh, I was loading 10 millimeter, now I want to load 9 millimeter. You just don't want to mix up stuff like that. So I try not to have a bunch of powder on the deck. I keep my powders up on a high shelf and only bring the bottles down onto the shelf when I'm using them to load. Just safety precautions like that. You should keep your, if you're storing powder or loaded ammo, gunpowder is not, it doesn't explode unless it's confined.
Right, right.
And so usually you want to leave your powder, if you're going to lock it up, put it in something like just like a sheet metal cabinet, so that you don't want to lock it up like in a safe or something that's going to contain an explosion. I mean, worst case scenario, just keep it in like a sheet metal locker or something. And again, don't expose it to temperature extremes. I know people, not just for safety issues, but I know some powders we discussed, they change, their burn rate characteristics change with temperature. Some go one way and some go the other way.
Some powders have what's called a temperature coefficient, and some have a positive and a negative. So a positive temperature coefficient is as it gets hotter, the powder becomes basically more volatile, so to speak. Your power factor will go up. The other ones are negative, and then as it gets hotter, they actually go down. And that's another thing you need to look at when you're trying to determine what powder you're going to use. Yeah. There's also a concern on powder if it goes bad. I know it'll develop a certain odor. I don't know, is it a sour smell or something like that?
Yeah, it should have a strong kind of a solvent smell if it's good. In fact, I'll find that if I've got, I store ammo in sealed GI ammo cans. Mm-hmm. And even if the ammo in it is loaded, when you open that case, you get this real whiff of this solvent smell. But apparently, if it's got this smell described as sour, that means it's probably past its burn before date, and you should get rid of it.
And the place to get rid of it is on your lawn.
Yeah. I mean, I like to make a little pile of it and burn it outside my garage.
Okay.
But, anyway. So handle the stuff, keep it safe and warm and dry, and it'll last indefinitely. I've got powder that I've had, cans of powder that are years old, and they still work. And loaded ammo, it lasts for years and years. I mean, I've got GI ammo. GI ammo usually has the primers and the bullets sealed into the case, and I've shot GI ammo that's 50 years old and it still works. But even stuff that I've loaded 10 or 15 years ago, I don't see any degradation in the quality of it if it's kept under good conditions.
Okay. So the next episode we're going to talk about testing your ammunition now, and that's primarily done with a chronograph. So we'll talk about setting a chronograph up, what they are, how they work, how to use them, everything like that. So that'll be the next step, is testing your ammo out.
Right. So, as usual, if you have any questions or comments, contact us at powerfactorshow@gmail.com or find us at our website, powerfactorshow.com. And until next time, I'm Rick.
And I'm Steve. And that's the way it is.